This budget does more than end a wasted decade. A decade marked by energy chaos, a crisis in aged care, skills shortages and stagnant wages, and not enough to show for $1 trillion in debt. It does more than draw a line under the drift, decline and decay that defined it. It begins to put things right. It begins to build a better future that befits our people and the sacrifices that they make for each other. A future we can all have a stake in, all sharing in its success. A stronger, more resilient Australia with more opportunities for more people in more parts of our amazing country. I commend the budget and the bill to the House.
Just 7 months after former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg delivered his budget in March, Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivered the first of 2 federal budgets that the Labor government will deliver this financial year. On this episode of Michelson Alexander Explains, we are joined by Michelson Alexander's founder and director, Steve Michelson, and communications specialist, Matilda for a comprehensive look at where Labor's priorities lie, whether they are following through on their election commitments, and how they plan to manage Australia's volatile economic forecasts, before looking ahead to what we might expect to see in May 2023's budget. Now, here's Steve and Tilly. Tilly, it was a much anticipated budget given it was Labor's first in almost a decade. Are you able to give us some of the keystone items that were announced last week?
There was quite a lot of key takeaways from this budget, considering that we've got a new Labor government. I think that one of the main takeaways was the cost of living package, which is going to cost about $7.5 billion. So the cost of living package consists of 5 different pillars. You've got cheaper childcare, expanding paid parental leave to 26 weeks, and it also encourages shared parenting responsibilities, cheaper medicines, and increased access to Medicare. What I think is quite interesting is a more affordable housing plan, which the government wants to build 1 million new homes over the next 5 years. It's going to be a cross-industry collaboration, so the states, territories and federal government will fund it, but they're only actually going to be responsible for about 55,000 homes. So it's going to be interesting how the rest of that funding actually, where that comes from. The private sector is going to have to do it, so it's going to be quite interesting how that plays out. And then the 5th pillar was getting wages moving again. We didn't see any immediate relief for wages, considering how high inflation is at the moment. So that'll also be interesting for the budget next year in May to see if there's any immediate wage relief. Another key takeaway was aged care, which was a massive part of Labor's election campaign. Another key takeaway is the NDIS. So funding is going to reach $166.6 billion over 4 years, which is an increase of $8.8 billion from the previous budget that we heard in March, I believe. And so Chalmers actually said afterwards, I thought was really interesting, is that we're expecting the NDIS to cost hundreds of billions of dollars over the next decade. And there's no indication at the moment as to where that money is going to come from. So it'll be interesting if that's going to be highlighted next year in May. Another key takeaway was climate change. And we know that from the previous 10 years, we haven't seen much funding towards climate change mitigation. And Australia has come under fire from the global stage for that. So we're going to see a massive shift this time. So it's the first federal budget to actually consider the economic impact of climate change. So we're going to be seeing $20 billion to fund projects to update our grids. We're also going to see tax cuts for non-luxurious cars like battery cars, hydrogen fuel cells, increasing solar panel access for people who live in apartments or regional towns or areas where there's not as much sun. There's disaster relief funding, which I think is huge considering we've had the bushfire season and the flooding recently. And I also thought it'd be interesting to see, we've got the COP27 starting on the 6th of November to see if the funding will change again leading into the May budget next year for climate change. I imagine there might be a lot of external pressure happening towards Australia. And then the final takeaway I thought was women. I think there's a massive change in this budget. We even saw a women's budget statement, which is the first time the federal government's actually done more gender responsive budgeting and actually made that a core part of this budget. So we're going to be seeing the key funding measures are going to be, in addition to things like parental leave and childcare, which is also aimed quite specifically at women, is Labor will commit $1.7 billion over 6 years to end violence against women and children, which I think is huge. And it's quite a stark contrast, I think, in this budget to the previous budgets, because I think in those previous budgets, a lot of the gender responsive budgeting that came about was only really in response to things like scandals in Canberra and revelations about sexism and Brittany Higgins and Christian Porter. So I think it's going to be quite interesting to see how this all unfolds out. And I think there's quite, from my perspective as a woman as well, it's quite enlightening, and it makes me a little bit happy to see a change like this happening. And then I think the final thing is it's going to be a gloomy couple of years ahead. And I think Chalmers was quite honest about that. From my perspective, he basically said that the budget's going to be a deficit for quite a long time and that we need to brace for that. And inflation, unfortunately, is going to get higher. Wages are going to be below inflation for a couple of years, hoping to kind of balance out by 2025. So yeah, I think those are the main takeaways.
And so as much as this is an opportunity for the Treasurer to outline, the dollars and cents, the allocations of funds, it's also an opportunity for government to signpost and basically tell their story about what's going to be in the government's eye line for the next 4 years, but the next 6 months for this government. Steve, I'll throw to you on this one. What do you think is the story that the Labor government's trying to tell?
Well, good to be with you, Gordo. Always love jumping on a podcast, particularly to talk about all things budget. So I think there are two key things here. First and foremost, I think Labor's delivered a budget which makes sure that it stays true to its election promises. That's also about responding to the fact that the last election in large part was run on themes around integrity. And we saw the Prime Minister say time and time again, that this would be a government that does what it says and says what it does. Labor will try and continue to deliver against that idea for as long as it can. But, come May's budget next year, it'll become more tricky to do that. I think the second key takeout from this budget, and we really saw it amp up in the days leading up to Jim Chalmers' speech last week, was around Labor trying to claim the ground as the responsible economic managers. We know time and time again in Australian politics, typically that Labor is the party for jobs, health, education. The coalition is seen and continues to be seen as the party that delivers on strong economic management and national security. And although those are all contested issues from election to election, really what Labor's trying to do, having had the government lose the May election so badly, is to take the opportunity to claim the space as the better economic managers. And that is both demonstrated in the rhetoric that both he and the Prime Minister, and indeed other members of the Labor team, parroting in the lead up to the budget. But it's also, I think, articulated in the rhetoric that was used on budget night, which was around, as Tilly said, the fact that this is a difficult economic period for the country.
There's been a lot of interest around the term of a well-being budget in the run-up to this release, the first budget for the Labor government. Has the government made good on this intention? Because as you've pointed out, Steve, it's kind of tiptoed between trying to convince citizens that they are the fiscal responsible managers that they want to try and promote themselves to be, but also being like, we're not cutting too much away. We're not cutting things out of government programs. Don't worry. We're still looking after our people. So is this an actual wellbeing budget, or is this a bit of spin from the government?
I think that's a great question, Gordo. And I think in some ways it depends on where you sit in society. I think that if you're an NDIS recipient, you'd have to say that this is a government that continues to support people with different abilities all across the country. So at the moment, I think it's a government that's delivering on its election commitments. It's a government that wants to be seen to be looking after Australians at large, that has responsible economic management. But the real test, I think, of whether or not it's staying true to the idea of it being a well-being budget is going to be in May next year. Why? Because that's when the government's going to have to start and look at cuts. And typically, I think, and certainly the real politic, I think, in Australia is that we typically judge governments as to how well they are looking after their citizens, not only by way of the investments that they make, but by how they choose to cut and trim government programs.
Yeah, I think we saw a few snippets in this budget for wellbeing. I think we've got an increase in funding for urgent care clinics, which is something that we haven't had in Australia before. New Zealand's done it and it's been quite positive so far. So the idea is that you have these clinics for non-threatening care, and that's supposed to sort of catch the more younger Australians who don't necessarily need the kind of attention that an emergency room would give you. So I think you've got a few benefits coming through for hospitals. You've got more funding for GPs, nurses in aged care. That's quite drastically going to increase, I think. Expanding the mental health service Headspace. We've got more mental health funding in regional towns. The fee-free TAFE, I think, is huge because that's going to be trying to fund the training of more healthcare workers. So I think we might see a difference in that over the next couple of years. But I think, it's going to be interesting to see what happens next year. I think we're seeing little snippets, but there doesn't seem to be there's no massive announcement so far for health or wellbeing.
And that's followed up probably in three of the major hot topics that come out of the budget this time. And first one we've mentioned a couple of times already is the NDIS, and that's mostly due to the forecasted cost increase and the beginning of a survey into how these costs can be mitigated or reduced or cut completely if necessary. So, Steve, what does this hold for the future of the key stakeholders in this sector, that being the people that rely on NDIS for support, but also the people that also work in the sector as NDIS suppliers?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think as federal budget goes, this was one that was very, very well delivered and executed upon by the government. The one kind of exception to that was the interview that Jim Chalmers did with Sarah Henderson on the 7:30 report after handing down the budget, where he confessed and then subsequently did not correct the record that the NDIS was going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars in coming years. And it's quite an extraordinary proposition. In terms of what it means for stakeholders, I think what it means is that there's a real need for stakeholders to probably pay a bit more attention than, if not already the case, to what's happening around the NDIS, but with a particular focus on this issue of the costings. So, for example, understanding, what are the publicised processes of government around the survey, around the decision making that will occur around the savings that are going to have to be made and will be made over time, but also what's happening behind the scenes and being really close to the intelligence of government and where government's thinking is up to. The NDIS is a massive government program that's important. Why? Because it provides incredibly valuable support to people with different abilities all across the country. But typically government is a bit of a slow-moving beast. So they might, for example, be looking at certain aspects of the NDIS and thinking about, look, where's the low-hanging fruit for savings, and then where are the more politically challenging areas. So stakeholders having a real understanding about those various moving parts, and again, what's publicised, what's public-facing and public knowledge, but also having an ear to the ground intelligence is incredibly important to then understand how is it that a stakeholder's strategic objectives may need to be realigned, may need to be amplified, basically what course of action an organisation needs to take to ensure that it is preserving its own, ultimately, commercial interests. Now, having said all of that, I think in this environment, one thing that stakeholders really do need to think about is offering up, where possible, savings options to government. I think the days of, organisations just sort of laying low or thinking that government's going to continue to boost the budget of the NDIS, I think those days are past. I think we're now in a space where it is incumbent on stakeholders to be thinking proactively about what savings options there are. So also giving that some thought, working out, what are the strategies that sit behind that, how is that best communicated to government, and also thinking about that insofar as, each individual stakeholder also being an actor as part of a bigger industry-wide effort to work with government on some of these savings issues. So I think there's a lot of work to do in that space to ensure that stakeholders are actually being cooperative with government, offering up savings where they exist, but also making sure that they're preserving their own interests and ultimately the interests of the people that they support.
So rather than handing out immediate cash-based relief to citizens, the government is committed to more investments in renewable energy, which I think we can all agree is much needed. So does this seem like the long-term approach for this Labor government, or will they have to pivot to the short-term relief?
It's such a great question. I mean, I think the starting point in answering it is this dragon of inflation that Jim Chalmers reminds us every day that we need to slay. I mean, the government is just in a hugely complex economic situation. It can't provide, cost of living relief in the form of handouts and then fuel inflation. But on the flip side, we know that Australians will walk if they don't feel like a government is in their corner. So I think, what you'll see is that the government will make investments to drive investment, such as the clean energy transition, such as building more housing and much needed housing stock with the superannuation industry. But having said that, they are going to have to consider what immediate pressures they can relieve for households across the country, because the one thing we know about Australians is that if they don't feel like the government is in their corner, they will absolutely walk. And I think the way in which they'll do that is to look at what regulatory mechanisms can be put in place, such as the price caps that we're starting to hear a bit more about around the energy space, electricity prices, such as establishing a domestic gas reserve, again, to help lower those energy prices. The issue in all of that, though, is that, none of it is straightforward. So if you think about the idea of establishing a domestic gas reserve, that considered independently on its face sounds like a very sensible idea. And in fact, it was Dan Andrews who said over the last weekend that why is it that we're competing for resources that we dig out of our own ground, And by what he's talking about there, though, is the fact that we've got, very well-established gas supply contracts into various foreign countries, many of which are in our region, many of whom make up a very important geopolitical climate, and obviously all of that connects pretty quickly through to China and some of those issues. So it's really, really difficult, but I think the only saving grace in all of this is that we've got an incredibly experienced bunch of people sitting around the cabinet table. I think there's a good bunch of senior public servants that sit around them. And so I think Labor will, over time, find a way through.
And so speaking of Jim Chalmers, for a man that likes to hang low, he's definitely been out in front of the press corp a lot in the last week, and he's continued to espouse this idea that super could be used as a lever for greenfield social investment, so into the renewable energy sector, into housing. But can this actually work? And is it sensible for the government to outsource investment decisions like this? And if it is sensible, what could it mean for stakeholders in those social investment sectors?
On the face of it, really support the idea of us using our multi-trillion-dollar superannuation system to achieve public good. I mean, I think that is absolutely consistent with the principles around the establishment of superannuation in the first place. So I think the more that we can utilise those superannuation funds for the public good to achieve our clean energy transition, to help build more much-needed housing stock in Australia, absolutely. Having said that, there's a couple of things I think we need to keep in mind. The first thing is that superannuation funds are there to deliver returns for shareholders, who are ultimately all of the Australians that pay their regular superannuation deductions into those funds. So there will be people out there much smarter than me who will be working out how is it that the investments into those areas of public good can be achieved while ensuring a strong and ongoing return for shareholders. I think the second thing is, in terms of moving to this model of co-investment, and again, on the face of it, I think it's a really good idea, we also need to think about what parameters do we put around that. For example, do we think that superannuation should be used for investment in Australia's defence? I mean, you could argue that one way for Australia to increase its defence spending, the commitments that have been made in that regard, and I think you'll notice that it's been supported on a bipartisan basis. Do we say that superannuation should be used to better fund Australia's defence? Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. But there are some of those related issues which I think over time will emerge. At the moment, we're talking about a very new model of co-investment, certainly at this scale. But I do think over time there will be questions about how it is used. And I think in all of that, we need to think about what do some of the other political actors do. Do we find the opposition piping up and saying, look, we think that, this model's great and it should be used in this way? Do we find that others do as well? So I think it's super exciting. And I'm really glad that, Jim Chalmers is talking about this. It doesn't surprise me. He's a very, very smart and accomplished guy. But I do think, this will become a political issue to watch over time.
So it's interesting that you mentioned defence there, because for all intents and purposes, this budget was quite inward looking. So does this hint that the government is less focused on the Indo-Pacific, which is an area which is becoming of increasing strategic interest for Australia?
No, I don't think we are seeing a move away from international relations in this budget. I think that this budget was very deliberately crafted, delivered, executed on the basis that Labor was wanting to deliver its election commitments. I think it achieved that goal. I think Labor has very much in this budget wanted to keep a domestic focus, particularly on the idea that they are the better economic managers as compared to the coalition. But in the budget, we still saw a number of important commitments and investments being made into our region. I think that's absolutely appropriate. It's consistent also with Labor's long-standing interest in the region. I think the other important thing to remember is that Labor is continuing to engage very, very strongly in the region. We know that we've got senior ministers continuing to travel throughout the Asia Pacific. We know that Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles is continuing to meet where he can with the Chinese administration to try and defrost some of those issues. And I think then in the May budget next year, we may see some more public-facing investments, if you like, in relation to the region, in relation to some of the geopolitical areas. But for now, I think it was very deliberately a domestic-focused budget.
And the other deliberate focus was, of course, the three S's. So they wanted to show themselves as safe, sensible and sound. So fiscal responsibility has been the key message point. But if we follow the budget or just politics through the 24/7 media cycle, it's all about the individual's hip pocket. It's all about, the cost of living crisis. And it's all about what happens next. And so we've got 6 months basically until the next budget. Are we going to see the government double down on being the fiscal responsible savings merchants? Or will they look to use some of that capital they've got over being in power for 6 months and maybe spend some more resources that they now have the trust in the society to do so?
Look, I think you'll actually find that the May budget next year will swing the pendulum back a bit towards the idea of savings and the idea of trimming government spending. We're never going to see under an Albanese administration a return to sort of Joe Hockey, Matthias Cormann, cigar smoking. I forget the turn of phrase that they use, but these sort of deep cuts on the basis that they're on the right side of history. Not just because I think Labor learned the lessons from the coalition's experience in that regard, but also just because I don't think it's what Labor stands for. I think Labor understands that they need to strike a balance between maintaining some pretty big expenditure around some of the programs like the NDIS, like Medicare, like Defence. But it also understands that needs to be balanced with responsible economic management. And so I think you'll see next May that they will start to send some signals around savings. But of course, there are all sorts of tricks of the trade that can be utilised in that regard. So for example, they can send some signals and they can, push some of the savings to the out years. Similarly, they can push some of the spending to the out years as well to try and frame up a budget that probably strikes a bit more of a balance. And I think we will see quite a deliberate contrast, though, to the budget that we saw last week, which was, again, just delivering on election commitments. So let's see what happens. And I think Labor will try to stick to those three S's as best it can, but it's going to start and get pretty tough for them.
Well, that probably brings us to the end of this roundtable episode of MA Explains. Thank you, Tilly and Steve, for joining us today. And those are fans of political analysis on a more long-term frame and more long-form format can look forward to more of our roundtables as we come into the Victorian election sooner rather than later. But if you're keen for that or any more of our analysis, please follow MA Explains either on YouTube or on your podcast platform of choice. And until next time, we'll talk to you soon.